Hi, my name is Jaideep Prabhu. I'm a professor of marketing at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. I grew up in India. I studied engineering as an undergraduate at IIT Delhi. I then went to the United States and got a PhD in management at the University of Southern California. Most of my research, at least in the first part of my career, was on innovation. How companies deliver new products and services for users. And most of that research was on how Western companies, especially large multinational companies, do innovation. But in the last 5 years or so, I've shifted my focus to emerging economies, particularly to low-income groups. And I've become very interested in how both large companies as well as small startups and entrepreneurs and also non-governmental organizations are increasingly innovating for and with low-income communities in countries like India, Bangladesh, various African countries, Latin America, and so on. I was struck by three ways in which emerging economy innovators, for instance in India, innovated relative to their Western counterparts. First, Indian innovators seem very frugal, very good at taking cost out of the entire innovation process and making do with limited resources. Maybe this is because their environment has limited resources. Second, they were very flexible in their mindset. They didn't plan too much and they were very good at switching from one plan to the next. And maybe this is because their environment is quite unpredictable. And the third thing I noticed was a lot of the solutions were inclusive. They were intended to bring people who are outside the formal economy into the formal economy. And maybe this is because there are many people who are outside the formal economy and that offers both a challenge and an opportunity. So frugal, flexible and inclusive. And when I asked people in India who had done this kind of innovation, how they would describe it, they often use a Hindi word called Jugaad. And so my co-authors and I wrote a book called Jugaad Innovation, where we describe, we talk about all these innovators and we try and identify some principles that drive this kind of innovation. Let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. So let's take fridges. Now in an affluent society, innovation in fridges may involve adding some new technology to the fridge, like for instance, maybe putting a tablet PC that will talk to you and you can talk to as a way to control the fridge. And that may add cost to the fridge, so you can get fridges like this which cost $3,000. In the Indian context, you're more likely to see a fridge that would cost $30, like one we studied, which was called the Mitti Cool. And this is a clay fridge that basically uses clay and the cooling properties of water as it evaporates through the clay walls to keep fruit and vegetables fresh for up to 5 days. This is a very frugal innovation. It uses widely available resources like clay and water. The innovator behind it, Mansukh Bhai, has a very flexible mindset. He was very good at improvising different aspects of this solution. And finally, it's inclusive because it is aimed at possibly hundreds of million people around the world who would like to have a fridge but cannot afford one, or even if they can afford one, don't have access to electricity. And like this, I could give you many other examples. For instance, incubators to save the lives of babies born prematurely. In affluent societies, these could cost about $20,000, and they would be very beautiful machines, and very few babies that have access to them would ever die, even if they're born prematurely. In the Indian context or in Africa or other Asian countries, it is very ineffective to have such an expensive solution because most people live in rural areas. They would not be able to afford such a device, and also even if they were able to afford it, they may not have electricity, there may not be someone to maintain it. In a situation like that, a very powerful solution is one that some students from Stanford developed and then tested in India and now selling in India, called the baby warmer. It's an Embrace baby warmer. It's not an incubator. It's a kind of blanket that the mother wears and carries the baby, and it has a pad that's made of a waxy phase change material that can keep temperature constant. And that can save the lives of babies who are born even 2 weeks prematurely and cannot maintain their body temperature. So it's these kinds of frugal, flexible and inclusive innovations that in India are called Jugaad innovations that you see equivalents of in other countries around the world, such as Bangladesh, that we would call Jugaad in India but would have different names in other countries. And I think these are very interesting to study because they can provide a quite powerful solution to the problem of unmet needs in health, in energy, in education around the world at relatively low cost. I've seen a very large interest and you could say emergence of such frugal solutions in Western countries for Western consumers. I think partly this interest in frugal innovation in affluent societies reflects some pressures on the financial situation of households and governments following the financial crisis. So there are some resource constraint pressures, negative pressures in the West. But there are also some positive drivers behind frugal innovation in the West. You see that increasingly, particularly I would say young people, are empowered and interested to do innovation in small groups with their friends using limited resources, which before only large companies could probably do in their R&D labs. Now it is possible for even students who have just come out of universities to actually come up with not only solutions but also market them in a very frugal way. I'll give an example of a group that is out of Chicago. They studied at Northwestern University. They call themselves Design for America. And what they did was, 4 of them, they said instead of going to Africa and Asia to solve problems, let's solve some in our American backyard. And they started with the problem of hospital-acquired infections, which actually killed something like 100,000 people every year in the US. It's a big problem. So they went to a local Chicago hospital and just by observing and talking to doctors and nurses, they came up with a solution. They realized first of all what was the problem, that often doctors and nurses want to clean their hands but they have to go to a wall unit and they don't have the opportunity all the time to do that. So they devised a solution, very intuitive solution. They said, well, we will take the wall dispenser of the gel and find a way to just clip it onto the garbs of the doctors and nurses. And they went back to their studio and with very basic computing equipment and a 3D printer, they came up with a prototype. Now they're manufacturing this solution and they are able to market it without having big advertising budgets, but using social media, using TED Talks and viral. So you see this kind of thing. In Cambridge, in England, where I teach, one of my former students, Eben Upton, created a company called the Raspberry Pi, where they created a $30 computer. The idea was to create a computer that was so cheap that you could give one to every school child in Britain, and they could play with it, they could open it up, look at how it was made, they could do coding for it, and there would be no fear of them breaking it. It would be so cheap. And so you see lots of these kinds of innovations happening in emerging economies, but also in developed economies. In March of 2012, I had this opportunity to visit BRAC, the world's largest NGO, which is based in Bangladesh. And that was a very interesting experience because here I saw an NGO, a non-governmental organization, which was as large as many corporations, possibly larger, but it was in the social sector. It was both a social organization, but equally an organization that had achieved the scale of commercial organizations and seemed unafraid to use many of the practices and strategies that commercial organizations around the world use. I found it a fascinating organization to then study, to find out more about how BRAC became BRAC, how it grew, and how it then conducts its various operations. Jugaad A frugal, flexible, and inclusive approach to innovation can and is making a big difference in the lives of people around the world.